The wind was a blade against her skin. It sliced through the thin satin of the wedding dress, a garment made for church pews and warm receptions, not for the unforgiving maw of a Montana valley in the heart of a blizzard. Each gust stole what little warmth she had left, leaving a deep, aching cold in her bones that felt less like a sensation and more like a finality. Evelyn clung to the saddle horn of the lone horse, her hands numb and useless inside gloves that were once white but were now stained with grime and a slow, dark weeping from the frostbite that had claimed her fingers. She did not know the horse's name. It had been tied to the back of the stagecoach, a stupid, frivolous expense her father had insisted upon so she might ride out to meet her intended, Rupert Haynes, like a lady of quality. The stagecoach now lay splintered and half buried in a snowdrift miles back. Its front axle snapped clean in two. The driver, a portly man with a kind face named Silas, was dead. He had been thrown when the coach overturned, his neck broken against a pine root hidden beneath the snow. He had not made a sound. She had been the only passenger, a bride, sent west like a parcel to a man she had never met, a man whose letters were curt and possessive, speaking of contracts and obligations, not of love. The wreck had been a violent, screaming chaos of splintering wood and panicked horses. When the silence fell, broken only by the shriek of the wind, she had found herself alive, trapped in the overturned carriage. It had taken her an hour to force the door, her shoulders screaming in protest. Outside, the world was a churning tempest of white. Panic had come first, hot and acidic in her throat. Then, a cold, hard resolve took its place. She would not die here. She would not be found frozen in a wedding dress, a tragic footnote in some territorial newspaper. She had a purpose, a grim duty to fulfill. To turn back was impossible. To stay was to die. So she had untied the horse, hoisted herself onto its back with a grunt of pain, and ridden on in the direction Silas had said the Haynes ranch lay. That had been hours ago, or perhaps a day. Time had lost its meaning, dissolving into a relentless cycle of wind, snow, and a pain that radiated from her left thigh. In the fall from the coach, her leg had been pierced by a shard of rock. She had torn a strip from her petticoat to bind it, but the bleeding had not stopped entirely. It had only slowed, the cold helping to staunch the flow, her blood freezing into a stiff, dark patch on the white fabric of her dress. Her vision swam, the endless sea of white blurring at the edges. The horse plodded onward, its head low, its breath pluming in the frigid air. It was a good animal, steady and strong, but even it was tiring. Evelyn knew she should stop, should try to find shelter, but there was nothing but snow-dusted pines, jagged gray rocks, and the oppressive, silent sky. She was a ghost in a dead world. Her thoughts, once sharp with defiance, had grown sluggish and thick. They circled back, again and again, to a place she had tried so hard to forget, a small room in Kansas, the scent of milk and lavender, a tiny, perfect hand wrapped around her finger, a promise she had broken. A whimper escaped her lips, freezing in the air. This was her penance, to freeze to death in her own wedding dress, a cruel mockery of the life she had been forced to choose over the one she had lost. The horse stumbled, jolting her from her stupor. She slid sideways, her grip failing. With a soft, resigned sigh, she fell from the saddle and into the deep snow. The impact was surprisingly gentle, the snow a soft bed for her weary body. She lay on her back, the flakes dusting her face like a funeral shroud. The pain in her thigh was a distant throb. The cold was gone now, replaced by a pleasant, floating warmth. She closed her eyes. It would be so easy to sleep, just for a moment. Dusk was settling, turning the white landscape to shades of gray and deep blue. When Callum first saw it, a patch of white near the trail that did not belong. At first, he thought it was a deer, fallen to the storm. He urged his horse. Bess, forward. his rifle resting easy across his lap. He was a man who moved with a quiet economy, his motions spare and deliberate. The cold did not seem to bother him. He was as much a part of this landscape as the gnarled pines and the granite cliffs. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, weathered by sun and wind, and bisected by a thin white scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not a deer, it was a woman. His eyes narrowed. She was lying in the snow beside a horse that stood exhausted, its reins trailing on the ground. She was dressed in white, a dress that looked impossibly fine, impossibly out of place, a wedding dress. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the snow. He knelt beside her, his movements careful, wary. Her face was pale as alabaster, her lips a faint, worrying shade of blue. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes and hair. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, beneath the line of her jaw. For a long moment, he felt nothing. Then, a faint, thready pulse fluttered against his fingertips, a hummingbird's heartbeat. She was alive, barely. He cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound. He had no love for complications, and a half-frozen woman in a wedding dress was the biggest complication he had seen in years. But leaving her was not an option. It was not in his nature. He had seen enough death. With a grunt, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile thing of bone and frozen fabric. Her head lolled back, and he saw the dark stain of blood on her dress, near her hip. He carried her to his horse, maneuvering her limp body onto the saddle in front of him. It was a clumsy, difficult process. He then caught the reins of her horse, tying them to his saddle horn. He mounted behind her, his body a shield against the wind. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her tight against him. She was so cold she felt like a statue carved from ice. He nudged Bess with his heels, turning her away from the trail and toward the dense timber where his cabin was hidden. The town was miles away, an impossible journey in this storm. His small, one-room hunting cabin was their only chance. The journey was slow, the horses struggling through the deepening snow. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful, lonely sound. Callum did not speak. He just rode, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the familiar terrain. The woman in his arms did not stir. She was a dead weight, her breathing so shallow he could barely feel the rise and fall of her chest against his. He could feel the grim calculus of survival ticking in his mind. He had to get her warm. He had to get those wet clothes off her. And he had to do it soon. The cabin was little more than a box made of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a testament to the fire he had banked before leaving that morning. He dismounted, and with considerable effort, managed to get Evelyn down from the horse. He half-dragged, half-carried her to the door, kicked it open, and brought her inside. The interior was Spartan. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A crude wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A narrow cot was pushed against the far wall, piled with furs and wool blankets. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, pine, and curing leather. He laid her down gently on the bearskin rug in front of the hearth, her white dress a stark slash of color against the dark fur. He worked quickly, his hands sure and practiced. He stoked the embers in the fireplace, adding dry kindling until a small flame flickered to life. He fed it larger pieces of wood until a steady, crackling fire was blazing, casting dancing shadows across the small room. Then he turned to her. He knelt beside her, his expression grim. This was the part he dreaded. It felt like a violation, but it was a necessary one. Her life depended on it. He started with her gloves, carefully peeling the frozen leather from her hands. Her fingers were waxy and white, the flesh stiff and unyielding. Frostbite, badly. He unbuttoned the long row of tiny, pearl buttons on the front of her dress. The fabric was stiff with ice, and his own fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the delicate fastenings. He worked his way down, peeling the sodden dress away from her body. Underneath, she wore a corset and layers of petticoats, all of it soaked and freezing. He cut the laces of the corset with his hunting knife, the sharp blade slicing through the canvas with a soft rasp. As he pulled the layers away, he saw them, bruises, dark, ugly smudges of purple and blue marred the pale skin of her ribs and shoulders. Souvenirs from the coach wreck. He saw the makeshift bandage on her thigh, soaked through with blood. He would have to deal with that, too. He rolled her gently onto her side to pull the dress from under her. And that is when he saw it. On her back, just below her left shoulder blade, was a mark. It was not a scar from an accident. It was deliberate, a small, intricate symbol, like a stylized flower, had been branded into her skin. The wound was old, but the scar tissue was thick and puckered. Someone had tried to hide it, or perhaps alter it, with a series of crude stitches that crisscrossed the original mark, making it even more hideous. It was a mark of ownership, a brand of shame. He had seen marks like it before, in places he did not like to remember. They were the work of cruel men who believed they owned the bodies of others. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He stared at the mark for a long moment, the firelight flickering over the scarred flesh. Whoever this woman was, she was running from more than just a wrecked stagecoach. He pulled a thick wool blanket over her, covering her from her shoulders to her feet. He then went to the small chest where he kept his supplies. He found clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, and a needle and thread. He cleaned and stitched the gash on her thigh with a surgeon's precision, his hands steady despite the grim task. He wrapped her frostbitten fingers in clean rags, hoping it was not too late to save them. He worked in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, his work complete. He had done all he could. The rest was up to her. He pulled his own bedroll from a corner and laid it out on the far side of the room, as far from her as he could get. Then he sat, and he watched, and he waited. Evelyn woke to the sensation of fire, not the welcoming warmth of a hearth, but a searing heat that consumed her from the inside out. A fever. She was lying on something soft, covered by a heavy weight, a blanket. She tried to move, but her limbs felt like lead. Her head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. She blinked her eyes open, her vision blurry. The room slowly came into focus. Rough log walls, a stone fireplace, the flames within it casting a warm, orange glow, and a man. He was sitting across the room, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out before him. His face was in shadow, but she could see the silhouette of him, broad-shouldered and still. He was watching her. Memory returned in a chaotic flood. The crash, the snow, the endless biting cold, falling, and then nothing, until now. She pushed herself up on her elbows, the movement sending a jolt of pain through her shoulder. The heavy blanket slipped down, pooling around her waist. She looked down and saw that she was wearing nothing but her shift. And it was not her shift. It was a man's linen shirt, large and coarse against her skin. Her own clothes, her dress, her corset, they were gone. A cold dread, far more chilling than the blizzard's touch, washed over her. She looked at the man, her eyes wide with a terror born from a past she could never escape. He had undressed her. He had touched her, while she was unconscious, helpless. "You," she rasped, her voice raw and barely a whisper. "You touched me?" The man did not move. He said nothing. "You had no right," she said, her voice gaining a fragile strength fueled by panic. "You had no right to put your hands on me." The accusation hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. It was the only weapon she had, the only defense she had ever known. For a long moment, he remained silent, his face unreadable in the shadows. She could feel his eyes on her, a steady, unnerving gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, devoid of emotion. "You were freezing to death. Your clothes were soaked." It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. Her mind, clouded by fever and fear, could not accept the simple logic of it. All she knew was the violation, the familiar, sickening feeling of a man taking what he wanted without asking. "Get away from me!" she spat, pulling the blanket up to her chin like a shield. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion. He was tall, taller than she had realized. He walked not to her, but to his bedroll on the other side of the room. He lay down, pulled a blanket over himself, and turned his back to her. He did not say another word. The silence he left behind was heavier, more profound than any argument. He had simply removed himself, granting her the space she had demanded. It was not the reaction she expected, and in her fevered state, it confused and frightened her even more. She lay back down, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of fear and pain. She listened to the sound of his steady breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the relentless scream of the wind, and she wept. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no escape. It dragged her down into a world of fractured memories. She was in a small, dark room, the air thick with the scent of cheap perfume and stale whiskey. A man's heavy breathing was in her ear. Then the scene shifted. She was running, her bare feet stumbling on a cold, hard floor. And then the dream she always had, the one that haunted her waking hours as much as her sleeping ones. She was standing over a small cradle. A baby, a little girl with a wisp of dark hair, was sleeping peacefully. Her heart ached with a love so fierce it was a physical pain, but she could not stay. A woman with a stern, pitying face was waiting by the door. Time to go, she had said. You made your choice. In the dream, Evelyn reached for the child, but her hands would not move. She tried to scream, but no sound would come out. The baby began to cry, a thin, desolate wail that tore through her soul. "I'm sorry," she whispered in her sleep, the words a ghost of a sound in the quiet cabin. "I'm so sorry." A sob broke from her lips, and she woke with a start, the dream's sorrow clinging to her like a shroud. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. The baby's cry still echoed in her ears. Across the room, Callum heard her. He had been lying awake, listening to the storm, when her soft, tormented whisper had cut through the night. He heard the sob that followed. He knew the sound of a soul breaking. He did not get up. He did not go to her. He knew that his presence would only frighten her more. Instead, he reached for a small log from the pile beside him and tossed it into the fire. It landed with a soft thud, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The flames leaped higher, pushing back the shadows, filling the small cabin with a little more light, a little more warmth. It was a small gesture, a silent acknowledgement, a way of saying, you are not alone in the dark. Evelyn saw the sudden flare of light. She saw the shadow of his arm as he tossed the log. She quieted, her sobs subsiding into silent tears. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, a strange and unwelcome sense of comfort settling over her. He had heard her at her most vulnerable, and he had not mocked her, or ignored her, or tried to touch her. He had just given her a little more light. Outside, the storm raged on, a symphony of fury and desolation. The snow piled deeper against the door, sealing the cabin off from the rest of the world. It fell for the rest of that night, and all through the next day, and the day after that. It buried the landscape, erased the trails, and silenced the world. It trapped the two strangers together in the small, firelit room, a man haunted by what he had done, and a woman haunted by what she had left behind. They were prisoners of the storm, and of the secrets that lay unspoken between them. The storm did not break. For 3 days, it held the world in a fist of white. squeezing the light from the sky and burying the valley under a silent, suffocating blanket. Inside the cabin, time became a slow, thick liquid, measured not in hours but in the feeding of the fire and the melting of snow for water. The fever left Evelyn as quietly as it had come, leaving her weak but clear-headed, her body a tapestry of aches and pains. They lived in a state of armed truce, moving around each other with a deliberate, careful choreography in the cramped space. He was a creature of routine, rising before the gray dawn to check his snares, returning with a frozen rabbit or a brace of grouse, his face impassive behind a beard frosted with ice. He would skin and prepare the meat with an economy of motion that was both fascinating and unsettling to watch. He never spoke unless a question required an answer. And then his words were like stones dropped into a deep well, brief and final. Evelyn, once her strength began to return, could not abide the idleness. She was not a woman built for sitting still. She swept the rough planked floor with a broom made of bound twigs. She washed their few utensils in a bucket of heated snowmelt. She insisted on tending to her own wounds, her hands clumsy but determined as she cleaned the gash on her thigh and rewrapped her frost-bitten fingers, which had begun to ache with a deep, thawing pain. Each small act was a reclamation of herself, a refusal to be merely a victim he had rescued. The silence between them was not peaceful. It was a living thing, a third occupant of the cabin, fraught with the weight of all the things they did not say. Her wedding dress, cleaned of its bloodstains and grime as best she could manage, hung from a wooden peg on the wall, a constant, ghostly reminder of the life she was supposed to be living. Callum never looked at it, but she felt his awareness of it, a symbol of the chasm between their worlds. The first argument began, as most do, over something small. He had returned from checking the perimeter of the cabin, his shoulders laden with snow, and found her outside, struggling to split a small log with a hatchet. The cold air bit at her lungs, and her arms trembled with exertion. He strode over, took the hatchet from her unresisting hands, and split the log with a single, effortless swing. "Get inside," he said, his voice flat. "You are not strong enough." A spark of defiance ignited in her chest. "I am not an invalid," she retorted, her chin lifted. "I will not sit by your fire like a porcelain doll while you do all the work." "This is not work for a doll," he said, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her worn shift and the tired lines around her eyes. "This is my cabin, my wood, my fire. You are my guest. A guest does not work." The word "a guest" felt like a cage. "And when the storm ends, what then? Will you escort your guest to her wedding?" The words were sharp, meant to wound. He turned away from her, stacking the split wood. "That is your business." "Is it?" she pressed, following him back into the warmth of the cabin. The injustice of her situation, the sheer, blind helplessness of it, boiled over. "I am trapped here with a man who will not even tell me his name, a man who undressed me while I was unconscious. And you expect me to simply trust that you are a gentleman?" He stopped, his back to her. His shoulders were a rigid line of tension. "My name is Callum," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And if I were not a gentleman, you would have known it that first night." The implication hung in the air, stark and ugly. She flinched, but she would not back down. "And what am I to you, Callum? A stray you brought in from the cold? A piece of property you found on the trail?" "You are a complication," he said, finally turning to face her. The firelight carved harsh lines into his face, illuminating the scar that ran along his jaw. "You are a woman in a wedding dress, bound for a man's ranch, who was found half dead miles from where she should have been. You tell me what you are." The truth was a stone in her throat. She could not speak of the shame, the coercion, the life she was running toward because she could no longer run from the one she had left behind. So she gave him a piece of it, a shard of the truth that was sharp enough to keep him at a distance. "I was on my way to marry Rupert Haynes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was an arrangement. My father's doing. Mr. Haynes is a man of considerable wealth." She loaded the name with all the coldness she felt. "He is a cattle baron, but he is not a man of kindness." She watched his face, expecting a flicker of recognition, perhaps of respect for a powerful name. Instead, she saw something else entirely. A stillness came over him, a chilling quiet that was more expressive than any outburst. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and his eyes, which were usually a guarded, neutral gray, darkened to the color of a stormy sky. The name Rupert Haynes had landed in the cabin like a lit stick of dynamite. "I know the name," he said, and the way he said it made her shiver. "He owns half this territory," she said, trying to fill the sudden, tense silence. "He owns what he can take," Callum corrected, his voice laced with a bitterness so profound it seemed to poison the air. "And he takes what he wants." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that made her feel as though he were seeing past her skin and into the ugliest corners of her soul. "I worked for him once, on his ranch." Evelyn felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The world, which had already felt impossibly small, seemed to shrink to the size of this tiny, snowbound room. "You worked for him?" "For a season," Callum said, turning to stare into the fire, his profile hard and unforgiving. "I saw the way he runs his operation. I saw the men he keeps around him. And I saw the women." He paused, and the silence stretched. "There was a girl, from the town, barely 17. Haynes kept her out at the ranch. He called her his housekeeper, but we all knew what she was. He paraded her around, bought her dresses, and then beat her when his temper got the best of him." Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, a chill settling deep in her bones. She could picture it all too clearly. "I tried to tell her to leave," Callum continued, his voice a low growl. "Offered to give her my wages to get her on a stagecoach heading east, but she was too scared. Haynes had threatened her family." He finally looked back at Evelyn. "One night, there was a disagreement, a violent one. I stepped in. Haynes did not take kindly to one of his hired hands interfering in his private affairs. The next morning, my horse was saddled, and I was told to ride and never look back. I took the advice." The story lay between them, a bridge of shared understanding built over a foundation of mutual disgust for the same man. The tension in the cabin shifted. It was no longer the sharp, wary dance of two strangers. It was something else now. The quiet, simmering hum of two people allied against a common enemy. In the days that followed, a fragile truce settled. Evelyn continued to help with the chores, and Callum no longer stopped her. She proved surprisingly capable, mending a tear in his canvas jacket with small, neat stitches, her frost-bitten fingers clumsy but precise. He showed her how to set a simple snare, his large hands guiding hers as he demonstrated how to tie the knot. His touch was impersonal, practical, yet a strange warmth spread through her at the brief contact. He began to talk more, though his words were still carefully rationed. He told her the names of the mountains that surrounded the valley, and how to tell the difference between the track of a wolf and that of a coyote. He spoke of the land with a quiet reverence, a deep and abiding respect that she found herself admiring. In turn, she spoke of her home in the East, painting a picture of a life that felt a world away. A life of manicured lawns and polite society that sounded hollow and false even to her own ears. One evening, he was cleaning his rifle by the fire, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a rhythmic counterpoint to the howling wind. He had taken off his shirt to better work, and the firelight played across the muscles of his back and shoulders. It was then that she saw them clearly for the first time. They were not like the scars from a fall or a fight. They were a lattice work of old, raised welts, a pale silvery pattern against his sun-darkened skin. They crisscrossed his back from his shoulders to his waist, each line a testament to an agony she could scarcely imagine. Whip marks. She drew in a sharp breath, He froze, his hands stilled on the rifle. He knew she had seen them. He did not turn around, did not try to cover himself. He simply remained still, waiting. Slowly, she rose from her chair and walked toward him. She knelt on the bearskin rug behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. She lifted a trembling hand, her fingers still tender and swollen from the frostbite, and gently, so gently, touched one of the scars. The skin was ridged and smooth, a dead, unfeeling landscape. He flinched at her touch, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles beneath her hand. But he did not pull away. She said nothing. There were no words for this. Her touch was her only language, a silent expression of an empathy that transcended words. She traced the path of another scar, feeling the history of his pain beneath her fingertips. In that quiet moment, with the fire crackling and the storm raging outside, their shared wounds seemed to connect them. Two broken people finding a strange solace in the geography of each other's scars. That night, the dam of their secrets finally broke. They sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer tense, but soft and expectant. It was Evelyn who spoke first, her voice a low, tremulous thing. "My father did not arrange my marriage to Rupert Haynes solely for the money," she began, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "He did it to save our family from shame, from my shame." Callum watched her, his expression unreadable. "2 years ago," she continued, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, "I fell in love, or I thought I did. He was a traveling artist, charming and handsome. He made promises he had no intention of keeping. When he left, I was with child." She took a shaky breath, the confession she had held locked inside for so long finally spilling out. "My father was a deacon in our church. The disgrace was more than he could bear. He disowned me. He sent me to a distant cousin's house to wait out my time. I had the baby. A girl." Her voice broke on the last word. "She was so beautiful, so perfect. But I had nothing, no home, no money, no name to give her. My father made it clear that if I kept her, he would cast us both out onto the street." Tears streamed down her face, but she did not bother to wipe them away. "I did the only thing I could think of. The cousin knew a preacher's wife who was traveling west. She had no children of her own. She agreed to take the baby. I gave my daughter away. Callum, I left her in Kansas with a woman I barely knew, with nothing but a locket and a promise that I would come back for her one day." The last words were a sob. "Then my father received a letter from Rupert Haynes, an old business associate. Mr. Haynes was looking for a wife. My father saw it as a solution, a way to be rid of me forever. So he sent me here, to be a bride to a man I have never met, to pay for my sins." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for, she did not know what. Absolution? Condemnation? He simply looked back at her, his gaze steady, and in his eyes, she saw not judgment, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. He let the silence sit for a long moment before he spoke. His own confession, a heavy stone, dropped into the quiet pool of hers. "The woman I told you about," he said, his voice rough. "The one Haynes kept at the ranch. She had a brother, Haynes's brother, Cyrus. He was worse than Rupert, meaner, crueler. One night, he came back from town, drunk and angry. He took his anger out on her." Callum's hands clenched into fists in his lap. "I heard her screaming. I ran to the house. I found him, hurting her. I pulled him off her. We fought. He pulled a knife. I got it from him." He looked down at his hands, as if seeing the weapon there again. "I killed him, Evelyn. I stabbed him in the chest, and I watched the life go out of his eyes. I did not feel a single moment of regret." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Haynes found me standing over his brother's body. His men would have hanged me from the nearest tree. I ran. I have been running ever since. The law in this territory belongs to men like Rupert Haynes. There is no justice for a man like me." The weight of their sins filled the small cabin, a palpable presence, A woman who had abandoned her child. A man who had taken a life. They were both fugitives, running from the ghosts of their pasts. They stared at each other across the fire, stripped bare, their ugliest truths exposed. And in that raw, terrifying honesty, something shifted. The space between them, once filled with suspicion and silence, now crackled with a new, dangerous energy. It was a volatile cocktail of shared pain, mutual desperation, and a slow-burning desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for days. It was the way his eyes lingered on her mouth when she spoke. It was the way her breath hitched when he stood too close. It was the primal, unspoken awareness of two lonely bodies in a small, isolated space. She was the one who moved first. She rose from her seat and walked the few steps that separated them, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knelt before him, her hands finding his. His were rough and calloused, but they were warm. She looked into his eyes, and she saw her own desperation mirrored there. She wanted to be seen. All of it, the good and the bad. She wanted to be touched, not with violence or coercion, but with a matching, desperate need. She wanted to feel something, anything, other than the gnawing guilt and the aching loneliness. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his. He was perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. It was not a plea, it was a demand, a surrender. "Take it all," she whispered, the words a raw, broken plea against his mouth. "My shame, my sin, everything, just take it." And with a strength born of pure, unadulterated desperation, she pushed him back, down onto the soft fur of the bearskin rug. For a heartbeat, he resisted, his body tense with surprise. But then, as her mouth found his again, a low groan rumbled in his chest, and he gave in, his arms coming around her, pulling her down to him. Their lovemaking was not gentle, or tender, or romantic. It was a storm, as wild and untamed as the one that raged outside. It was a collision of two broken souls, a frantic, desperate search for oblivion in each other's arms. It was the tearing of cloth, the rasp of skin against skin, the taste of salt from their tears and sweat. It was a raw, shattering release of all the pain and tension and fear they had held inside for so long. It was a desperate, primal act of survival, a way of feeling alive in a world that had tried so hard to kill them. But afterward, as they lay tangled in the firelight, their breathing ragged, the cold reality of what they had done crashed down upon Evelyn. The brief, fiery oblivion receded, and the guilt came rushing back, a tidal wave of shame. This was not redemption. This was just another sin, another mark against her soul. She pulled away from him, scrambling to her feet and snatching a blanket to cover her nakedness. She turned her back to him, her body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable shudder. She could not look at him. She could not bear to see her own weakness reflected in his eyes. The cabin was silent once more, but the silence was different now. It was no longer the quiet of unspoken truths. It was the deafening roar of a truth that had finally been spoken, an act that could never be undone. The morning arrived not with a gentle dawn, but with a cold, unforgiving light that seeped through the cabin's single window. It was the color of steel, stripping the warmth from the room and leaving only the gray ashes in the hearth and the stark reality of the night before. The fire had died, and a chill had crept into the small space, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. Evelyn was awake first. She had been for hours, lying perfectly still on her side of the bearskin rug, the rough wool blanket clutched to her chin. Every muscle in her body ached with a profound weariness, and a hollow shame had carved out a space in her chest. She could still feel the phantom sensation of his hands on her skin, the desperate strength of his body against hers. It had been a moment of madness, a frantic attempt to burn away the pain, but the morning light revealed it for what it was, another scar on her already damaged soul. When Callum finally stirred, the sound was an intrusion in the heavy silence. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his tangled hair. his back to her. He did not speak. The silence stretched, growing heavier and more awkward with each passing second, thick with recrimination and regret. It was Evelyn who finally broke it, her voice brittle as ice. "Did you get what you wanted?" The words were quiet, but they struck the air like a whip. Callum froze, his hand dropping from his hair. He slowly turned his head to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Evelyn," he began, his voice rough with sleep. "Do not say my name," she snapped, pushing herself into a sitting position and wrapping the blanket tighter around her. Her eyes, which had looked at him with such raw vulnerability the night before, were now hard and accusing. "You saw a desperate woman, and you took advantage. You used me." The accusation was a lie, and she knew it. She had been the one to initiate it, the one who had whispered the words, the one who had pushed him down. But the self-loathing that churned in her gut was too much to bear, and it was easier, so much easier, to cast him as the villain than to face the truth of her own brokenness. A flicker of something, hurt, confusion, anger, passed across Callum's face before his expression settled back into its familiar impassive mask. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. She wanted him to argue, to defend himself, to shout. She wanted a fight, a fire to burn away the cold shame. But he gave her nothing. He rose from the rug without a word, his movements stiff. He pulled on his trousers and his worn leather boots. He shrugged on his heavy coat, took his axe from its place by the door, and walked out of the cabin. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Evelyn alone in the suffocating silence. A moment later, she heard the sharp, rhythmic crack of the axe biting into wood, each blow a punctuation mark to her misery. She sat for a long time, listening to the angry sound of his chopping. The rhythm was relentless, a violent, steady beat that seemed to echo the frantic pounding of her own heart. She hated him for his silence, for his refusal to engage in her self-destruction. She hated him for making her feel something, for cracking open the shell she had so carefully built around herself. And most of all, she hated herself. The chopping continued for what felt like an eternity, the sound a constant, grating presence. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The sudden silence was more jarring than the noise had been. Evelyn waited, her body tense, listening for the sound of his footsteps returning to the cabin. But there was nothing, only the low moan of the wind in the pines. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence from outside the cabin grew from a simple absence of noise into something heavy and unnerving. A knot of unease began to twist in her stomach. She told herself she did not care. He was a grown man. He could take care of himself. But the image of his face, the flicker of hurt in his eyes before he had shuttered it away, kept replaying in her mind. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She dressed quickly, pulling on the practical wool trousers and shirt he had given her, which she now wore instead of the tattered remains of her undergarments. She slipped on the heavy boots, which were far too big for her, and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders before stepping outside. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath. The storm had lessened, the snowfall reduced to a fine, swirling mist, but the air was still bitingly frigid. She saw him near the edge of the clearing, leaning against the trunk of a massive pine, his back to her. The axe lay on the ground near a pile of freshly split wood. "Callum," she called out, her voice thin in the vast, white wilderness. He did not answer. He did not move. A prickle of real fear ran down her spine. She trudged through the deep snow toward him, her oversized boots sinking with each step. As she drew closer, she saw it. A dark stain was spreading across the snow at his feet. Blood. "Callum," she cried, breaking into a clumsy run. She reached him and saw that he was clutching his left forearm, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. Blood seeped between his fingers, a shockingly bright crimson against the white snow. "Let me see," she demanded, her voice shaking. "It is nothing," he grated out, his jaw tight with pain. "It is not nothing," she insisted, gently but firmly prying his hand away from the wound. A long, jagged splinter of wood, thick as her thumb, was embedded deep in his forearm. The wood around it was a mangled mess of torn flesh and blood. The axe, in his anger, must have slipped, the handle shattering and driving a shard into his arm. Without another word, she took his good arm and pulled him toward the cabin. He resisted for a moment, then relented, allowing her to lead him like a chastened child. He stumbled slightly, and she realized he was lightheaded from the loss of blood. Inside, she sat him down on one of the crude chairs by the hearth. Her earlier anger and shame were forgotten, replaced by a surge of focused urgency. She stoked the fire, adding logs until it was blazing, chasing the chill from the room. She heated water and gathered the same supplies he had used on her, clean cloths, whiskey, and his needle and thread. She knelt before him, her hands surprisingly steady. "This will hurt," she said, her voice soft. He gave a curt nod, his eyes fixed on some distant point over her shoulder. She took a deep breath and, with a pair of pliers from his toolkit, gripped the end of the splinter. She pulled, hard and fast. He let out a sharp hiss of breath through his teeth, his entire body going rigid, but he made no other sound. The splinter came free with a sickening squelch, and a fresh torrent of blood welled from the wound. She worked quickly, cleaning the gash with the whiskey-soaked cloth, her touch gentle but efficient. He flinched as the alcohol bit into the raw flesh. As she stitched the wound closed, her head was bent low over her work, her hair falling forward to veil her face. The silence in the room was different now. It was not the cold, angry silence of the morning, but a quiet, fragile intimacy. She was tending to his wound, just as he had tended to hers. It was an apology, an act of penance, and a silent acknowledgement of the bond between them, a bond that had been forged in pain and sealed in desperation. When she was finished, she bandaged the arm tightly with a clean strip of linen. She kept her hand on his arm for a moment longer than was necessary, her thumb stroking the back of his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low murmur. He was looking at her now, his gray eyes clear and direct. The wall he kept around himself had cracks in it, and in those cracks, she saw something that looked like vulnerability. She looked away, her cheeks flushing with warmth. The closeness between them had returned, but it was different this time. The wild, desperate energy of the previous night had been replaced by something softer, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. Later that day, as she sat by the fire, mending the tear in his shirt from where she had cut the sleeve to access his wound, she finally gave voice to the fear that had been her constant companion. "I have to find her," she said, not looking at him. "My daughter." Callum was sitting at the table, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone the only sound in the room. He paused, his hands still. "I think about her all the time," Evelyn continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I wonder if she is warm, if she is safe, if the woman who took her is kind. I told myself I was giving her a better life, but I was just a coward. I ran away. I cannot live like this anymore. Callum, I cannot build a life on the foundation of a child I threw away. I regret it. Every single day, I regret it." She finally looked up at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Once the storm clears, I am not going to Rupert Haynes. I am going to Kansas. I am going to find my daughter." He set the knife and the whetstone down on the table. He looked at her, his expression serious, his gaze unwavering. He did not ask how she would get there, or what she would do when she arrived. He did not point out the foolishness of a lone woman traveling hundreds of miles with no money and no plan. "We will find her," he said. The word stunned her into silence. "We?" "You cannot go alone," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It is a long way to Kansas." "But," You are a wanted man, she stammered. Haynes, the law. Haynes, the law, he repeated, his voice flat. It does not matter. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the full, unguarded depth of his commitment in his eyes. He was choosing her. He was choosing her past, her mistakes, her daughter. He was choosing it all. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath washed over her. And so they began to plan. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by a storm, but partners in a desperate venture. They took stock of their meager supplies: a small sack of flour, some dried meat, coffee, and salt. Callum had a rifle and a handful of cartridges. It was not much, but it was a start. He talked of selling the furs he had trapped to get money for a wagon and supplies in a town far to the south, a town where no one knew his face or Rupert Haynes's name. A quiet hope, fragile and tentative, began to grow in Evelyn's heart. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel utterly alone. One morning, 2 days later, she woke to an unfamiliar sound. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. The sound was the rhythmic crunch of horse hooves in deep snow, coming closer. Callum was already on his feet, his rifle in his hand. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through a small crack in the shutter. "Riders," he said, his voice grim. "2 of them, heading this way." A cold dread washed over Evelyn. "Who is it?" "They are flying the brand of the Circle H," he said, pulling back from the window. "Haynes's men." Panic seized her. They had been found. What do we do? Callum's mind worked quickly. "There is a space under the floorboards," he said, moving to the bearskin rug and pulling it aside. He pried up 2 of the planks, revealing a dark, shallow space below, smelling of damp earth. "Get in, and no matter what you hear, do not make a sound." She did not hesitate. She scrambled into the cramped, cold space, pulling her knees to her chest. Callum replaced the floorboards and the rug, plunging her into near-total darkness. She could hear him moving above her, kicking some stray pieces of firewood to obscure the lines of the planks. Then, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. Through a thin crack between the floorboards, she could see a sliver of the room. She saw Callum open the door. 2 men stood on the threshold, their figures dark silhouettes against the bright snow. One was a tall, lean man with a cruel-looking mouth and a pistol strapped to his hip. The other was younger, barely a man at all, with a nervous energy about him. "Mornin'," the taller man said, his eyes sweeping the interior of the cabin. "We are looking for someone." "This is private property," Callum said, his voice flat, his body blocking the doorway. "We are on business for Mr. Rupert Haynes," the man said, as if the name were a key that could unlock any door. "We are looking for his bride. There was a stagecoach wreck a few days back. We found the driver, dead, but the woman was gone. Tracks led this way before the storm covered them." He stared hard at Callum. "You seen a woman, dressed in a fancy white dress?" "I have been here for a week. Snowed in." Callum lied, his voice steady. "Have not seen anyone." The man, Jed, was not convinced. His eyes darted around the cabin, lingering on the wedding dress that still hung from its peg. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. "That is a mighty fine dress for a man who lives alone," Jed sneered, nodding toward it. "Found it in the wreck," Callum said without missing a beat. "Figured it might fetch a price in town." Jed grunted, unconvinced. He looked at Callum's bandaged arm. "Have some trouble." "Axe slipped," Callum said curtly. The 2 men exchanged a look. Evelyn held her breath, certain they would push their way inside. But Callum was an imposing figure, his hand resting casually near the hilt of the knife on his belt, his stance unwavering. Finally, Jed seemed to make a decision. "All right," he said, his voice full of gravelly suspicion. We will be on our way. But I will tell you this, Mr. Haynes does not take kindly to losing his property. If we find out you are lying, he will come for you himself, and he has a long memory." With a final, lingering glare, the man turned and mounted his horse. The younger man followed suit, casting a nervous look back at the cabin. Evelyn listened to the sound of their horses' hooves crunching in the snow, the sound slowly fading until it was gone, swallowed by the vast silence of the valley. She waited until she heard Callum replace the bar on the door before she pushed up on the floorboards. He helped her out, his hands gentle on her arms. She was trembling. "They are gone," he said, his voice low. "They did not believe you," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "They will be back. Haynes will come." That night, the fear of Haynes's return hung over them like a shroud. As they sat by the fire, Evelyn knew she had to tell him the rest of it. The final, shameful piece of the truth. "It was not just my father's shame," she said quietly. "Rupert Haynes blackmailed him. My father owed him a great deal of money from a business venture that failed. Haynes knew about my situation. He offered to forgive the debt in exchange for a wife, a young, presentable wife to give him heirs and solidify his position in the territory. I was a commodity. Callum, a piece of property to be traded to settle a debt." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a desperate need for him to understand. "I agreed to it. I agreed to marry him to save my family from ruin." He listened in silence, his expression hardening as she spoke. When she was finished, he reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His grip was warm and steady, a silent anchor in the storm of her fear. As the days passed and the snow began to melt under the strengthening sun, their bond deepened into something that felt frighteningly real. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. He told her of his childhood on a small farm in Ohio, of the wanderlust that had driven him west. She told him of her love for books, of her dream of one day becoming a teacher. They fell into a comfortable domesticity, working together, sharing meals, their lives intertwining in the small, isolated world of the cabin. She began to allow herself to dream of a future with him, a life built not on shame and obligation, but on the quiet strength and gentle kindness she had found in this unexpected man. She imagined a small homestead, a garden, the sound of her daughter's laughter filling the air. She began to believe that she could be happy, that she could be loved, not in spite of her broken past, but because of it. But doubt was a persistent, nagging voice in the back of her mind. Could a love born in a storm survive the harsh light of day? Could his quiet strength bear the full weight of her broken past? She was a danger to him. Jed's threat echoed in her ears. Haynes will come himself. She could not be the reason Callum was caught, the reason he was hanged. The thought was unbearable. She loved him too much to destroy him. And so, that night, after he had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, she made a decision. She rose from her bedroll as quietly as a shadow. The moon was high, casting a silvery light through the window. She dressed in the warmest clothes she had, pulling on the heavy coat and the clumsy boots. She scribbled a hasty, tear-blotted note, leaving it on the table. It was a lie, a story about going on her own, about not wanting to be a burden. The truth, that she was leaving to save him, was too painful to write. With one last, lingering look at his sleeping form, she slipped out of the cabin, the cold air a brutal shock. She did not look back. She plunged into the snow-filled woods, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between them, to protect him from the wrath that was coming for her. She would face Rupert Haynes alone. It was the only way. The cold woke him. It was a sharp, invasive chill that had nothing to do with the embers dying in the hearth. It was the cold of an empty space beside him, the cold of a room that had suddenly grown too large. Callum's eyes snapped open. The first gray light of dawn was filtering through the window, and the place on the bearskin rug where Evelyn had slept was a hollow, empty nest. He sat up, his senses on high alert, a profound and immediate dread, cold and heavy as a river stone, settled in his gut. He scanned the small cabin. Her few belongings were gone. The blanket she had used was folded neatly on the chair, and on the crude wooden table in the center of the room lay a small, folded piece of paper. He did not need to read it to know what it was. He knew with a certainty that went bone deep. He rose, his movements stiff, and walked to the table. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he picked it up. Her handwriting was a series of elegant, slanted lines, blurred in places where a tear had fallen. Callum, the note read, "I cannot be a burden to you. What comes for me is my own to face. Do not follow. I will not be the cause of your ruin. Forgive me. E." A low, guttural sound, something between a curse and a roar of pure frustration, tore from his throat. He crumpled the note in his fist, the paper a fragile, useless thing. Forgive her? He would not. He would not forgive her for her foolish, noble, self-destructive sacrifice. He would not forgive her for thinking he was so weak, so brittle, that he would break under the weight of her troubles. And he would not, under any circumstance, let her go. He moved with a furious, focused energy. He pulled on his boots, his coat, his gloves. He checked the load in his rifle, his face a mask of grim determination. He did not waste time with supplies or food. He would find her, and he would find her quickly. He threw open the cabin door and stepped out into the frigid, pre-dawn air. The world was a sea of unbroken white, the new snow a blank page on which she had written her desperate story. Her tracks were clear, a line of clumsy, deep-set prints leading away from the cabin and into the dense, dark woods. She had no plan, no sense of direction. She was just running. Running to protect him. The thought fueled the fire in his veins. He began to track her, his long, deliberate strides eating up the ground. He was a man born to this wilderness, and he read the signs of her passage as easily as she might read a book. Here, where she had stumbled, her handprint a perfect, fleeting fossil in the snow. There, where she had paused to lean against a tree, the bark disturbed. She was on foot, in boots not made for this terrain, and she was already tiring. He could see it in the shortening of her stride, in the way her tracks began to weave. He did not call out her name. Words were useless now. This was a primal act, a pursuit born of a connection that had gone far beyond language. He was a hunter, and she was his quarry. But he was not hunting to kill. He was hunting to save, to reclaim what was his. Not his property, not his possession, but his choice. She was his choice. An hour passed. The sun began to rise, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. He found a single glove, half buried where it had fallen from her pocket. He picked it up and pushed it into his coat, his jaw tightening. The air was getting colder, the wind picking up, whispering through the high branches of the pines. She could not survive long out here. He found her in a small clearing, where a cluster of aspens stood like pale, slender ghosts against the dark backdrop of the pines. She had not made it far. She had collapsed at the base of a large, snow-dusted boulder, her body curled into a tight ball, as if trying to conserve the last of her warmth. She was not moving. For a single, heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late. He broke into a run, the snow churning under his boots, his breath tearing at his lungs. He reached her side and fell to his knees, his hands reaching for her. She was not unconscious. Her body was racked with violent, silent sobs, a grief so profound it had stolen her voice. Her face, when he gently turned it toward him, was a mask of frozen tears, her lips blue, her skin a waxy, translucent white. Frost had begun to crystallize on her eyelashes and the edges of her hair. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, despair, and a heartbreaking, defeated resignation. He did not speak. He did not offer words of comfort or anger. He simply gathered her into his arms, lifting her from the snow as if she weighed nothing at all. He wrapped his coat around her, cocooning her in his own body heat. Her head fell against his chest, and she let out a small, broken sound, the fight finally gone out of her. He carried her back the way they had come, his steps sure and steady. The anger that had propelled him was gone, replaced by a fierce, aching tenderness that was almost painful in its intensity. He held her tight against him, his body a shield against the wind, his chin resting on the top of her head. He could feel the fine tremor that ran through her, the deep, shuddering cold that had taken root in her bones. He walked without stopping, his gaze fixed on the distant curl of smoke that was his cabin, his home, the only sanctuary he could offer her. He carried her across the threshold and kicked the door shut behind them, sealing them back inside their small, isolated world. He did not put her down. He carried her straight to the hearth and gently lowered her onto the bearskin rug. As close to the fire as he could get her, he stoked the embers, adding kindling and logs until a roaring fire blazed, its heat a welcome, living presence in the room. He knelt before her and began the slow, methodical process of warming her. He pulled off her frozen boots, his hands surprisingly gentle as he chafed her icy feet. He stripped off her wet gloves and socks, his own skin burning where it touched hers. She was passive, pliant in his hands, her eyes following his every movement with a dull, exhausted detachment. When he had done all he could, he sat back on his heels. He looked at her, truly looked at her, taking in her pale, tear-streaked face, her trembling lips, the sheer, utter defeat in her eyes. And the dam of his silence finally broke. "You do not get to decide," he said, his voice low and raw with an emotion she could not name. It was not just anger. It was something deeper, something more wounded. "You do not get to decide that my life is more valuable than yours. You do not get to decide what I can and cannot bear. And you do not get to decide that I would not stay." He leaned in closer, his gray eyes boring into hers, demanding that she see him, that she hear him. "My choices are my own. Evelyn, I chose to pull you from that snowbank. I chose to bring you here. I chose to listen to your truths, and I am choosing to stand with you, no matter what comes. That is my right. You do not get to take that away from me." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, her throat working, but no sound coming out. He was right. In her desperate attempt to protect him, she had completely dismissed him. She had treated him not as a partner, but as a liability. She had made a choice for him, assuming he was not strong enough to make it for himself. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of despair. They were tears of shame, of regret, of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. "I was trying to save you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "And I am trying to save you," he countered, his voice softening. "From the cold, from Haynes, from whatever it is that makes you think you deserve to be alone in all this." And then, the final wall around her heart crumbled into dust. The secret she had guarded so closely, the one she believed was too ugly, too unforgivable for anyone to bear, came spilling out. "You do not understand," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a broken, chaotic rush. "It is not just that I left her. It is that she is alive. Callum, my daughter, she is alive right now. And I do not know where she is. She could be hungry. She could be living in poverty, cold and afraid. She could be with people who are cruel to her. And I am here, warm by a fire, while she suffers. I cannot live with that. I cannot just build a new life and pretend she does not exist. It is not a memory I am running from. It is a living, breathing person, my child, and I have to make it right. I have to find her and beg her to forgive me, even if she never does. I have to try." She finally fell silent, her confession hanging in the air, raw and bleeding. She had shown him the most wretched, shameful part of herself, the part that had abandoned her own flesh and blood. She waited for the revulsion, the judgment, the look in his eyes that would tell her she was irredeemable. But it never came. He simply listened, his expression softening into one of profound, heartbreaking empathy. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs gently wiping the tears from her cheeks. "And you thought that would make me leave?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. He shook his head slowly, a sad, small smile touching his lips. "Evelyn, you have it all wrong." He settled back, his gaze turning inward, to a place of old, deep pain. "I told you about the woman at Haynes's ranch," he began, his voice a low murmur. "The one his brother hurt. Her name was Eliza. She was not just some girl I felt sorry for. I loved her." Evelyn stared at him, her own sorrow momentarily forgotten. "She was a schoolteacher from back east," he said, his eyes unfocused, lost in memory, full of life and laughter. "She came out here with so many dreams. But this land, and the men on it, broke her. After what Cyrus did to her, she was never the same. The light just went out in her eyes. I tried to help her. I begged her to let me take her away, but she was trapped by fear, by shame." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "One morning, I went to see her. I found her by the creek. She had walked into the water and let the current take her. She took her own life because she could not live with what had been done to her, and I was not there to stop her." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I have carried that guilt every day since, the guilt of not being strong enough, not being fast enough, of not saving the woman I loved." He finally looked at Evelyn, his eyes clear and filled with a fierce, unwavering conviction. "I will not make that mistake again," he said, his voice ringing with the force of an oath. "I will not stand by and watch another woman I care for be destroyed by the shadows of these men. Your past does not frighten me. Evelyn, your daughter does not frighten me. The only thing that frightens me is the thought of you facing it all alone." The air between them was charged, electric with the weight of their shared confessions. All the secrets, all the ghosts, all the pain had been laid bare. They were two people, stripped of all pretense, their scarred souls visible to each other in the warm firelight. He leaned forward, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. She met him halfway, her hand coming up to rest on his jaw, her fingers tracing the line of his scar. His lips met hers, and this time there was no desperation, no frantic hunger. It was a kiss of aching tenderness, a profound and mutual surrender. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow, but also of a fierce, defiant hope. He gently lowered her back onto the fur rug, his body covering hers. Their movements were slow, deliberate, unhurried. It was not a taking, but a giving. Each touch was a question, each caress an answer. It was an act of healing, a quiet, reverent exploration of each other's wounds. He kissed the bruises on her shoulders, the faint scars on her hands, as if he could erase the pain of their creation. She traced the whip marks on his back, her touch a silent promise of solace and acceptance. They came together not as a collision, but as a quiet, inevitable joining. Two halves of a fractured whole finally finding their fit. It was a moment of perfect, unadorned grace, a fragile sanctuary in the heart of a brutal, unforgiving world. In the morning, the world outside was transformed. The storm had finally, truly cleared. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun, when it rose over the snow-covered peaks, flooded the valley with a clean, hopeful light. It was as if the world, like them, had been purged and given a new beginning. They stood at the window, side by side, looking out at the changed landscape. The path forward, which had been obscured by the storm, was now clear. "We will go to Kansas," Callum said, his voice firm with resolve. "We will find your daughter. Together." He turned to look at her. "But first, there is something we must do. We cannot run from Haynes. A man like that will not stop hunting you. We have to face him. We have to get your freedom, once and for all." A cold knot of fear tightened in Evelyn's stomach, but she pushed it down. He was right. Running would only postpone the inevitable. She nodded, her expression as determined as his. "All right," she said. "We face him." She walked over to the peg on the wall where her wedding dress still hung, a pale, silent specter of the life she had been forced into. She took it down, the fine satin cool beneath her fingers. She looked at it for a long moment, at the intricate lacework, the tiny pearl buttons, the long, delicate veil that was meant to have hidden her face as she pledged her life to a monster. With a steady hand, she took Callum's hunting knife from its sheath on the table. She gathered the fine tool of the veil in her fist and, with a single, sawing motion, cut it free from the headpiece. The sound of the blade slicing through the delicate fabric was a final, satisfying severing of her ties to the past. She walked to the fireplace and held the veil over the flames. It hesitated for a moment, then caught, curling into a black, shriveling mass before erupting into a brief, bright flare of orange light. They watched it burn until it was nothing but a wisp of gray ash, carried away up the chimney. She was no longer a bride. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman who had finally chosen her own path. At dawn, they were ready. They packed their few possessions, saddled the 2 horses, and stood for a moment at the door of the small cabin that had been both their prison and their sanctuary. Callum took one last look around, then pulled the door shut. They mounted their horses and rode out into the bright, cold morning. Their face turned toward the east, toward the rising sun and the Circle H ranch. They rode not as a cowboy and a runaway, but as partners, equals, bound by a love that had been forged in the fiercest of fires. They did not know what awaited them, but they would face it together. They rode for 2 days, the landscape slowly transforming around them. The jagged, inhospitable peaks of the high country gave way to rolling foothills, and then to the vast, open plains of cattle country. This was Rupert Haynes's domain, a kingdom built on grass and beef and the unyielding will of its master. The air itself seemed different here, heavier, charged with a sense of ownership that was as palpable as the biting wind. They traveled by night and rested during the day, hiding themselves in copses of cottonwood or shallow ravines, away from the prying eyes of ranch hands. Callum knew this land, knew its rhythms and its secrets. He navigated by the stars, his course as true as a compass needle, his expression a mask of grim resolve. As they drew closer, a tense silence fell between them. The fragile hope that had bloomed in the cabin was now tempered by the cold, hard reality of what they were about to do. They were 2 people, armed with little more than a rifle and a desperate plan, riding into the heart of a lion's den. On the evening of the 2nd day, they saw it. The Haynes homestead was not a ranch. It was a fortress. It sat squat and arrogant in the center of a wide, treeless valley. A 2-story timber house built for dominance, not for comfort. A high fence, its posts thick as a man's thigh, enclosed the main house, the bunkhouse, the barns, and a web of corrals. Lights burned in the windows, yellow and watchful in the deepening twilight. The place was alive, a hornet's nest of activity. Even from a distance, they could hear the rough laughter of men and the low, mournful sound of cattle, and they could see the guards. 2 men patrolled the perimeter of the fence, rifles held easy in their arms, their dark shapes moving with a lazy, confident authority. "He is expecting trouble," Evelyn whispered, her voice tight with fear. "He has always expected trouble," Callum corrected. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the layout of the ranch. "It is the only way a man like him knows how to live." They dismounted in a shallow, brush-choked gully a half-mile from the homestead, the last place they could remain concealed. From here, they could do nothing but watch and wait. The plan they had made in the relative safety of the cabin now seemed thin and hopelessly naive. "Stay here," Callum said, his voice a low command as full darkness settled over the valley. Keep the horses quiet. I will be back before moonrise." "Where are you going?" she asked, her hand instinctively reaching for his arm. "To see an old friend," he said, his hand briefly covering hers, his touch of fleeting reassurance. "There is a boy who works in the stables. Billy. I knew him when he was just a tyke. Used to sneak him sweets from the cookhouse. He has good eyes and a quiet mouth. He might listen. For a price." Before she could protest, he was gone, melting into the shadows with a hunter's grace. Evelyn was left alone with the two horses, the vast, menacing silence of the plains, and the steady, frantic beating of her own heart. The next few hours were the longest of her life. She listened to every rustle of the sagebrush, every distant coyote's call, her imagination painting a dozen different terrible scenarios. Just as the first pale sliver of the moon began to climb the star-dusted sky, he reappeared, as silent as a ghost. He crouched beside her in the darkness, his breath coming in steady, even plumes. "Billy is still there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He is scared. Everyone is. Haynes has been in a black rage since his men returned from my cabin. He has been drinking heavily. He has doubled the guards on the house itself." Evelyn's heart sank. "Then it is impossible." "No," Callum said, and she could feel the grim determination radiating from him. "It is just harder. Billy told me Haynes has been spending all his time in the main house, mostly in the parlor at the front. He also confirmed that the lock on the larder door at the back of the house is still broken, an old injury from a drunken brawl that Haynes never bothered to fix. It is our way in." He paused, turning to her in the darkness. "But I cannot go in with you. Not at first. He will be on his guard if he sees me. But you, he will be arrogant. He will think you have come crawling back. He will want to gloat. That will be his mistake." The plan settled into place, cold and terrifying. The next morning, as the sun climbed the sky, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the valley, Evelyn prepared herself. She had shed the last vestiges of the frightened, runaway bride. She wore the simple wool trousers and shirt Callum had given her, her hair pulled back in a severe, practical knot at the nape of her neck. She was no longer a piece of property to be claimed. She was a woman coming to state her terms. She walked out of the gully and began the long, lonely trek up the dirt track that led to the main house. The world seemed preternaturally quiet, the only sound the crunch of her boots on the frozen ground. She could feel the eyes on her. Ranch hands stopped their work in the corrals, turning to stare at the lone woman walking with such resolute purpose toward the house of the man they all feared. They murmured to each other, their curiosity piqued. The man named Jed was the one who met her at the porch, the same tall, cruel-mouthed man who had come to the cabin. His eyes widened in genuine shock, followed by a slow, mocking sneer. "Well, I will be," he drawled, leaning against a post, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Look what the cat dragged in. Get tired of playing house with that mountain man, little bride?" Evelyn stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her gaze fixed on him, her expression unreadable. "I am here to speak with Mr. Haynes," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror that was churning in her stomach. "Mr. Haynes is busy," Jed scoffed, "and I do not think he is in the mood for visitors, especially not ones who caused him so much trouble." "Nevertheless," Evelyn said, her voice dropping, taking on a hard, non-negotiable edge, "you will tell him I am here." Before Jed could spit another insult, the front door of the house swung open. Rupert Haynes stood on the threshold, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was a man in his late 40s, powerfully built, his expensive clothes unable to hide the brutish strength of his body. His face was flushed with drink, but his eyes were cold and sober, small, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. They swept over Evelyn, taking in her plain, functional clothes, her determined stance. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of welcome. It was the smile of a collector who had just seen a prized possession. one he thought lost, wander back into his grasp. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low, amused rumble. "The prodigal bride returns. It seems the wilderness did not agree with you after all." He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving her face. "Jed, that will be all. Our guest and I have some private matters to discuss." Jed straightened up, a flicker of surprise on his face, but he obeyed without question, tipping his hat with mock politeness to Evelyn as he sauntered off the porch. "Come in, my dear," Haynes said, his voice dripping with false civility as he held the door open for her. "We have a contract to discuss." Evelyn ascended the steps, her back straight, her head held high. She walked past him and into the house. The moment she was inside, she heard the heavy, definitive click of the key turning in the lock behind her. She was in the lion's den, and the door had just been sealed. The parlor was exactly as she had imagined it would be, a monument to a rich man's vanity. The furniture was dark, heavy, and ornate. The walls covered in a blood-red paper and adorned with the mounted heads of deer, elk, and a massive snarling bear. A gun rack, filled with expensive, gleaming rifles, stood against one wall. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, leather, and whiskey. Haynes gestured to a chair, but she remained standing. He walked to the fireplace, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I must admit, I am surprised," he said, not looking at her. "I had expected to have my men drag you back here in chains. Your voluntary return is more convenient. It saves me a great deal of effort." He finally turned to face her, his smile gone. "You have caused me considerable embarrassment. Evelyn, my property ran away. My men were made to look like fools, and I have been denied my husbandly rights." "The agreement is null," Evelyn said, her voice shaking slightly but her resolve firm. "I will not marry you. Mr. Haynes, I have come to tell you that to your face." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a harsh, barking laugh, utterly devoid of humor. "You will not marry me?" he repeated, taking a step toward her. "My dear girl, you seem to be under a grave misapprehension. You have no choice in the matter. Your father's debt is still very much outstanding. The contracts are signed. You belong to me." "I belong to no one," she said, taking an involuntary step back. "Oh, but you do," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing purr. He began to circle her, his movements slow and predatory. "You see, I have had a great deal of time to think these past few days, and I have had my associates do some research into your past. A very interesting past it is, too." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. "Tell me," he said, stopping directly in front of her, his proximity suffocating. "How is your daughter?" The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. All the air seemed to have been sucked from the room. "Ah," he said, a look of triumphant cruelty on his face. "So it is true. A little girl, I believe, left with a traveling preacher and his wife, a man by the name of Miller, in a small, dusty town in Kansas called Hope's Crossing." He leaned in closer, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her face. "It is a fragile thing, is it not? A child's life, especially a child with no name, no protection." "You monster," she breathed, her mind reeling with terror. "I am a businessman," he corrected, his voice like silk, "and I am merely protecting my investment. You will honor our agreement. You will be my wife. You will stand beside me and smile and give me the airs I require, and in return, your little secret will remain safe. Your daughter will continue to live her quiet, anonymous little life. But if you defy me, if you try to run again—" He let the threat hang in the air, its implications more terrifying than any direct statement. "A word from a man like me carries a great deal of weight." A child could simply disappear, or find herself in a much less charitable home, an orphanage, perhaps, or worse. Do you understand me? She understood. He had found her one true weakness, the one thing she would do anything to protect, and he was using it to crush her. Despair, black and absolute, threatened to swallow her whole. It was at that moment that a sound echoed from the back of the house, the distinct, splintering crack of a wooden door being forced from its frame. Haynes spun around, his face contorting in a mask of fury. "What in the hell was that?" He did not have to wait long for an answer. The parlor door burst open, and Callum stood on the threshold, his face a thundercloud of cold, controlled rage. Haynes's shock lasted only a second before it curdled into a snarl of pure hatred. "You!" he spat. "The stable hand who kills his betters." Callum did not waste time with words. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his fist connecting with Haynes's jaw with a sickening, solid crunch. Haynes staggered back, crashing into a small table and sending a porcelain lamp smashing to the floor. He came up, roaring with fury, and charged at Callum. The 2 men collided in the center of the room, their fight a brutal, desperate explosion of violence. It was not a fight of skill or finesse. It was a raw, primal struggle for dominance. They crashed into furniture, their grunts of pain and effort filling the room. A chair splintered under their combined weight. Haynes was bigger, heavier, fueled by whiskey and rage, but Callum was faster, his movements leaner, his every blow driven by years of pent-up guilt and a burning need to protect the woman cowering near the fireplace. Evelyn watched in horror, her mind frozen with terror. The room was a whirlwind of violent motion. She saw Haynes land a heavy blow to Callum's ribs, saw Callum answer with a sharp, punishing jab to Haynes's gut. They were going to kill each other. Then her eyes fell on the gun rack. Something inside her snapped. The fear, the despair, it all burned away, replaced by a single, incandescent point of pure, cold fury. She would not be a damsel in the corner. She would not let these men decide her fate. She would not let this monster win. She scrambled to the wall, her hands closing around the cold, heavy steel of a Winchester rifle. It was heavier than she expected, but she barely noticed. She lifted it, her movements sure and steady, and with a click that sounded as loud as a cannon shot in the small room, she cocked the hammer. The sound stopped the fight instantly. Both men froze, their chests heaving, their faces bruised and bleeding. They turned to look at her. Callum's eyes were wide with surprise, but also with a dawning, fierce pride. Haynes's face was a mask of utter, complete disbelief. The woman he considered his property, his meek little bride, was standing there, a rifle in her hands. Its dark, unforgiving muzzle pointed directly at his heart. "It is over, Rupert," she said, her voice a low, steady thing that did not tremble. Haynes stared at her, then at Callum, and a bitter, humiliated fury twisted his features. He had lost, he knew it. The gun in her hands had stripped him of all his power. "You will write a letter," Evelyn commanded, her voice gaining strength. "You will write it now. You will state that our marriage agreement is terminated by mutual consent. You will state that my father's debt to you is forgiven in its entirety. You will sign it, and you will date it." For a moment, he looked as though he might refuse, his pride warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Callum stepped forward, wiping a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth. "And you will keep silent about my past," he added, his voice a low growl. "You will tell everyone what you always have, that your brother Cyrus was a fool who got himself killed in a hunting accident. Your silence in exchange for ours, a fair trade. I think that was the final blow. The threat of his own dark secrets being exposed was enough to break him. Defeated, his shoulders slumped. He staggered over to a large oak desk, pulled out a piece of paper and a pen, And with a hand that shook with barely suppressed rage, he began to write. When he was finished, he shoved the paper across the desk. Evelyn kept the rifle trained on him while Callum read it, his eyes scanning the words to ensure there was no trickery. He gave a curt nod. They had it, her freedom, in writing, but it was not enough. Callum moved to stand over the defeated man, who was now slumped in his chair. "One more thing," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The girl, in Kansas. You will tell us everything you know." Haynes looked up, a final flicker of defiance in his bruised eyes. "Go to hell!" Callum's hand shot out, grabbing the front of Haynes's shirt and hauling him halfway out of his chair. "I have been there," he snarled, his face inches from Haynes. "And I have nothing left to lose. You will tell me, or I swear on Eliza's grave, I will finish what I started with your brother, right here on this floor." The threat and the name of the woman he had driven to her death was enough. The last of the fight went out of Rupert Haynes. He broke, in a low, spitting voice. He told them everything: the town, Hope's Crossing, the name of the preacher, Thaddeus Miller, and the fact that he had heard the Millers were planning to move on, to head further west. It was not much, but it was a beginning. It was a direction. It was a name. Callum released him, and Haynes fell back into his chair, a broken, humiliated man. Evelyn kept the rifle steady as they backed out of the room, the signed letter clutched tightly in her free hand. They did not run. They walked, with a calm, deliberate purpose, out of the house and into the bright, cold sunlight. They did not look back. They rode away from the Circle H ranch, leaving the fortress and its vanquished king behind them. The sun was at their backs. The precious, hard-won letter was tucked safely in Evelyn's shirt, and the road to Kansas stretched out before them, a long and uncertain path toward a future that was, for the first time, entirely their own. The road to Kansas was a long, slow unwinding of the soul. They left the mountains and the snow behind, riding down into a world of endless grass and sky, a world that was vast and empty and full of a terrible, aching promise. The signed letter from Rupert Haynes was tucked inside Evelyn's shirt, a fragile piece of paper that was both a shield and a key, her declaration of independence and her passport to a life she had never dared to imagine. They rode for days that blurred into weeks, the rhythm of their journey dictated by the sun and the endurance of their horses. They were a strange, solitary pair, a man with a haunted past and a woman in pursuit of a ghost. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer the tense, wary thing it had been in the cabin. It was a comfortable, shared space, a testament to the unspoken understanding that flowed between them. He would watch over her as she slept, his rifle across his lap, his gaze sweeping the dark, rustling horizon. She would tend to the fire, her hands, once soft and useless, now capable and sure as she cooked their meager meals of dried meat and coffee. They were weathered by the journey, the sun and the wind carving new lines into their faces, stripping them of all that was soft and unnecessary. Evelyn's skin, once pale and protected, darkened to a healthy bronze. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was slowly burned away by the relentless sun, replaced by a hard, bright kernel of hope. Callum, in turn, seemed to shed a layer of the grim solitude that had clung to him for so long. The guarded watchfulness in his eyes was still there, but now, when he looked at her, it was softened by a deep and quiet tenderness. They finally crossed into Kansas, the air growing thick and humid, the land flatter and dustier than anything Evelyn had ever known. The name of the town, Hope's Crossing, felt like either a cruel joke or a divine sign, and she did not know which was worse. It was a small, sorry-looking settlement, a handful of clapboard buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness of the plains. Its main street a river of fine, pale dust. They found the preacher's house at the edge of town, a small, neat building with a whitewashed fence and a struggling vegetable garden. A woman was on the porch, shaking out a rug. She was thin and careworn, her face a map of worries, but her eyes, when she looked up at them, were kind. Evelyn dismounted, her legs unsteady after so long in the saddle. Her heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs. This was it, the moment she had both dreaded and yearned for, the culmination of her long and painful journey. Callum remained on his horse, a silent, watchful presence a few feet behind her. "Mrs. Miller?" Evelyn asked, her voice a dry, tight thing. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps just curiosity, in their depths. "I am," she said. "Can I help you?" "My name is Evelyn," she began, her throat closing around the words. 2 years ago, you were traveling through Emporia. A baby was given to you. A little girl." The kindness in Mrs. Miller's face was instantly replaced by a look of profound, sorrowful pity. She set the rug down, her hands wringing in the fabric of her apron. "Oh, dear child," she whispered, "you have come all this way." She looked past Evelyn to Callum, then back again, her expression one of deep sympathy. "Please, come inside." The inside of the house was as neat and spare as the outside. It smelled of soap and baked bread. Mrs. Miller led her to a small, worn settee in the parlor. "We called her Sarah," the preacher's wife said, her voice soft. "She was a beautiful child, so quiet and sweet. I loved her as if she were my own. My husband, Thaddeus, he adored her." She looked at Evelyn, her eyes full of a genuine, unpitying understanding. "I know why you did what you did. A woman alone in this world. You have to make hard choices. I never judged you for it." "Where is she?" Evelyn asked, the words a raw, desperate plea. "Is she here? Can I see her?" "Mrs." Miller's face crumpled. She reached out and took Evelyn's hands in her own. Her hands were rough and chapped, but her touch was gentle. "Oh, my dear, she is not here. You are too late." The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from Evelyn's lungs, leaving a cold, hollow void. "Too late?" she repeated, the words making no sense. "Thaddeus and I, we are not young," Mrs. Miller explained, her voice thick with regret. "And our life is a hard one. We move from town to town, with barely enough to feed ourselves. It is no life for a child. A few months ago, a good couple passed through here, the Hendersons. They were on their way to Oregon to start a farm. They had a fine wagon, and they had just lost their own child to a fever the winter before. They fell in love with Sarah the moment they saw her. They could give her everything we could not. A home, a future, stability." She squeezed Evelyn's hands. "They adopted her, legally. They gave her their name. We thought it was for the best. We thought you were never coming back." Every word was a nail being hammered into Evelyn's coffin of hope. Adopted, a new name, on their way to Oregon. It was a distance as vast and unreachable as the moon. The thread that had connected her to her daughter, a thread she had clung to for 2 long years, had just been irrevocably severed. She did not remember leaving the house. She was aware of Callum's hand on her arm, his steady presence guiding her away. He led her to a small, muddy river at the edge of town, where a few ancient cottonwoods offered a sliver of shade. And there, on the banks of that slow, brown river, she finally broke. The grief came not as a flood, but as a slow, silent collapse. She sank to the ground, her body folding in on itself, and she wept without sound, her shoulders shaking with the force of a sorrow so profound it had no voice. All the miles, all the hardship, the confrontation with Haynes, the burning of the veil, it had all been for nothing. She had come all this way only to find that she had lost her daughter all over again. And this time, it was for good. She was a failure, a mother who had arrived too late. Callum did not try to comfort her with empty words. He did not tell her it would be all right. He simply knelt in the dirt beside her, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the swirling chaos of her grief. He waited until the first violent storm of her sorrow had passed, until her weeping had subsided into a series of ragged, exhausted shudders. Then he put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "We will keep riding," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble against her ear. "We will ride to Oregon. We will ride to the ocean if we have to. We will keep riding until we find her." She looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She saw in his eyes not pity, but a fierce, unshakable resolve. He meant it. This was not her quest anymore. It was theirs. And in that moment, she knew that as long as he was with her, she would not give up. And so they rode on. The weeks turned into months. The green plains of Kansas gave way to the endless, dusty expanse of the high desert. They traveled across forgotten landscapes, through hard-scrabbled towns and lonely army outposts. Their search a slow, painstaking process of asking questions, of following whispers and rumors. They were always a step behind, a season too late. They heard of a family named Henderson who had passed through a town in Nebraska, but they had left a month before. They found a record of them buying supplies in a fort in Wyoming, but no one knew where they had gone from there. The summer faded into a crisp, golden autumn. They worked odd jobs to earn money for supplies, Callum hiring on for a week at a time as a ranch hand, his skill with horses undeniable, while Evelyn took in mending or helped in the kitchen of a local eatery. They lived a hard, rootless life, but they lived it together. The shared hardship, the constant searching, the cycle of hope and disappointment. It did not break them. It forged them. In the quiet hours by the fire, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, they built a world of their own, a world of two people against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Their love, born in a desperate, snowbound cabin, had been tempered in the fires of their long and arduous quest, and it had become a thing of quiet, unbreakable strength. Winter found them in the foothills of the Rockies, in the burgeoning, muddy city of Denver. They were weary, their hope worn thin as an old blanket. They had followed a rumor, a whisper from a lonely trapper that a family with a small, dark-haired girl had settled in a valley to the north, but the trail had gone cold. Another dead end. It was in Denver that Evelyn, seeking a moment of peace from the relentless search, found herself standing outside a tall, grim-looking brick building with a simple wooden cross over the door. The sign read, "St. Swithin's Orphanage for Foundling Children." On a sudden, inexplicable impulse, she pushed open the heavy door and went inside. The air inside was cold and smelled of lye and boiled cabbage. A stern-faced nun with eyes that had seen too much sorrow looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice as starched as her wimple. I am looking for a child," Evelyn began, her voice faltering. It was a fool's errand. She knew it, but she had to ask. "A little girl. She would be about 3 years old now. Her name might be Sarah, or Henderson. She has dark hair, and my eyes." The nun's expression did not change. "We have many children here with dark hair, madam, and many of them have sad eyes." Defeated, Evelyn turned to leave, but as she reached the door, she heard the sound of children's voices, reciting a lesson in a sing-song chant from a nearby room. And on some wild, desperate hope, she turned back. May I just see them?" she pleaded. "Just for a moment." The nun hesitated, then gave a curt, reluctant nod. She led Evelyn to the doorway of a large, cold schoolroom. About 20 children of various ages sat at small wooden desks, their faces pale and serious, and Evelyn's eyes scanned them. one by one. Her heart a heavy, leaden thing in her chest. There were several dark-haired girls, but none of them felt right. And then she saw her. She was sitting in the back row, a small, solitary figure, her head bent over a slate. She was tiny for her age, with a cascade of dark, tangled curls that fell over her face, as if sensing she was being watched. The little girl looked up, and Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The child had her eyes, the same shape, the same shade of deep, thoughtful blue. It was her. She knew it with a certainty that was as primal and absolute as a mother's love. "That one," Evelyn whispered, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. "In the back. What is her name?" "Her name is Anna," the nun said. "She was brought to us 2 months ago. The family that had her, the Hendersons, they were on their way to Oregon when their wagon overturned in the mountains. The parents were killed instantly. The child was found wandering in the woods by a prospector. She does not speak, not a single word since she arrived." Evelyn walked into the room, her movements slow, as if in a dream. The children all stopped their chanting to stare at her. She walked to the back row and knelt before the little girl. The child stared back at her, her expression wary, her blue eyes wide and frightened. "Anna," Evelyn said, her voice a soft, trembling thing. "That is a beautiful name." The little girl just blinked, her small hands clutching the piece of chalk she held. Evelyn's heart ached with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. What could she say? How could she bridge the years of silence and abandonment? And then she remembered a song, a simple, nonsensical lullaby she had made up and sung to her baby in the few, precious weeks they had had together. She began to hum, the melody soft and tentative at first. The little girl's head tilted, a flicker of something in her wide, silent eyes. Evelyn's voice grew stronger, and she began to sing the words, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The moon is a boat on a silver sea. Sail away, my sweet, sail away with me, to the land of dreams, where the stars all bloom, and I will keep you safe in this little room." As she sang the last line, the little girl's face, which had been a mask of frightened emptiness, suddenly crumpled. A memory, deep and long buried, had surfaced. A single, perfect tear rolled down her cheek, and then, in a voice that was small and rusty from disuse, she whispered a single word. "Mama?" Evelyn let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, and gathered her daughter into her arms. The little girl was stiff at first, then, slowly, her small arms came up and wrapped around Evelyn's neck, her tiny body relaxing into the embrace she had been deprived of for so long. "I am here, my love," Evelyn whispered into her daughter's tangled hair, tears streaming down her face. "I am here, and I will never, ever leave you again." When they left the orphanage an hour later, the little girl's hand was held tight in Evelyn's. Callum was waiting for them outside, his face etched with a worried anxiety. He saw them, and his expression softened. The little girl, whose name they had learned was truly Sarah, looked up at the tall, quiet man with the kind eyes. She shyly withdrew her hand from her mother's and slipped it into his. Callum's large, calloused hand closed around hers, and in that simple, profound gesture, their family was finally made whole. They did not go to Oregon. They turned back into the mountains and found a small, forgotten valley, a place of tall pines and clear, rushing water, a place where they could finally be at peace. With the last of their money, they bought a small plot of land and, with their own hands, they built a home. It was not a fortress like Haynes's ranch, or a temporary shelter like the cabin. It was a home, built of love and resilience and the quiet, steady work of their hands. They lived there, in that quiet mountain valley, not as a runaway bride and a haunted cowboy, but as equals. They were partners, bound by a history of pain and survival, and a fierce, abiding love that had been tested and proven true. Sarah, who slowly began to speak again, filled their small home with a laughter that was the sweetest music Evelyn had ever heard. One cold night, years later, they sat before the fire, just as they had in that first cabin. Sarah was asleep in her small room, safe and warm. A gentle snow was falling outside, blanketing their peaceful valley in a soft, silent white. Evelyn leaned her head against Callum's shoulder, watching the dancing flames. "You took it all," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, wondering joy. "My shame, my fear, my loneliness. You took it all." She turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "And I gave it all. My secrets, my heart, my trust. And I do not regret a damn thing." He did not answer with words. He simply leaned in and kissed her shoulder, right over the faint, silvery trace of the brand that was hidden beneath her dress. He kissed the scar, a mark of her painful past, but a past that had, against all odds, led her here. To him, it was a scar that was healed, a scar that was finally, completely, hers. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.